Well, Alan and Kathy, thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this, and to all of you who have joined this morning. Really lovely to see you. It was really nice hearing all the hellos and welcomes as you joined the Zoom meeting. So what a lovely space to be in, particularly talking about thorny issues like the economy. I made the mistake this morning of getting in a bit of a Twitter debate, something I'm trying not to do too much. But I was listening this morning actually to the discussion on GMS, and Joyce McMillan, who you heard from last week, and I think she may have joined at some point. I saw her name come up. Had a lovely sentence that she uttered on the GMS discussion this morning, just after 8 o'clock, saying that the question of our time is, can we break our addiction to an economy that does so much devastation to our environment? And so I love that, because I think I agree with her. So I tweeted it. And a couple of the comments that have come back just, I guess reinforced my despair sometimes with the state of the debate around the economy. So one of them was from someone I admire greatly, Branko Milanovic, who works for the UN and who's a very, very well-known economist who does a lot of work on inequality, but he has been really digging his heels in over the question of economic growth and how valuable it is in terms of meeting other I guess objectives of what society is about. And he sort of tweeted back and said, well, do you think just because the economy's declined by 10%, is that something you'd be really happy about? And then the other comment that came back was, well, poverty and starvation, there's your answer. And I think those two comments just really, in a way, encapsulate the sort of narrow mindset that so much of our thinking around the economy has been stuck in. And so, I mean, Branko's point to me, I can sum it up in a way by saying, of course, having low GDP growth in an economic system that is dependent on GDP is a bad thing. It's like in a petrol car. If you run out of petrol, that's a bad thing. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's the right sort of car to be taking us on our next year of the journey. And then the other question around poverty and starvation, I think, ignores so much of the evidence that while we've had growing economies over the last few decades, we've also had rising levels of inequality. We've had growth alongside poverty. We've had growth alongside falls in life expectancy, and rising gaps between health outcomes, rising levels of inequality in health outcomes. We've had rising GDP. Well, we've had poor quality jobs. So the UK in the last few years and decades even has been celebrating its low levels of unemployment. And then as soon as you lift the bonnet of those employment figures, you see just how bad quality so many of those jobs are, where people are quite literally treated as just-in-time inventory, where they're on demand, literally at the click of an app, forgetting the very importance of your decent work. And so I think this almost blind faith that if we grow the economy, that will automatically translate to good quality lives, people feeling better about their futures, people feeling they've got financial security on which they stand, people feeling that their children and their grandchildren will have better prospects than themselves, let alone attending to the environmental question, which I think you discussed a few weeks ago, that those assumptions can no longer be relied on. And the evidence is that in the past, when we did good things with growth, that did translate to sort of social progress in the various dimensions. So after the Second World War, which was described as the golden age of capitalism, if you like, GDP growth was used to invest in our collective institutions, our health services, our education systems. We had very high levels of progressivity in our tax system. And so we didn't have rising levels of inequality. The growth was channeled to those who need it. So there's the longitudinal perspective shows us that when growth is used well, it can be translated to good outcomes. There's also a country by country perspective, which shows us that in lower income countries, there is a translation between GDP growth and social progress in terms of poverty reduction, life expectancy, education, and so on. And I can point you later to some of the literature on that. But the reality is that today, in rich countries like the UK, like Australia, where I'm from, like the US, the job of GDP growth has been done. We've got more than enough wealth, but we're absolutely terrible at sharing it. And so the challenge is that if we revert, as we emerge from COVID, to those old recipes, we're not taking into account this new reality that we're in, with the reality of climate breakdown, the reality of pushing up against 4 of the 9 planetary boundaries. We're setting ourselves up for more and more challenges. And so this is I think this is the question of our time. How can we create and imagine a different economic system that is better than growth, that doesn't rely on growth, even with all those dubious assumptions that it no longer translates to the sort of things that we really need in our societies. It doesn't translate to job quality for enough people, doesn't translate to financial security for enough people, and it's pushing up against planetary boundaries in such a devastating way. And the challenge is, I think, is that our mindsets and our political discussions and our metrics have locked us into this box where almost the best we can hope for is putting a nice adjective on growth. So because we're so stuck around growth, we can't break out of this idea of growth. So we have sustainable growth or inclusive growth or low carbon growth or organic or low fat growth. I mean, it's almost becoming an absurdity, and we just cannot move away from growth. And yet growth in itself, isn't delivering what we need. So we need to really open up our imaginations to the possibility of doing things differently. And in the past few decades, almost this has been the social democratic consensus. The model has been grow the economy faster and faster, but turn a blind eye to the collateral damage that does to people and planet. And then step 2 is, through the political system, sequester as much of the bit of tax as you can out of that. And then step 3 is use that tax to try to patch up and heal and clean up so much of the damage that was done in step 1. And so a lot of our social policy, a lot of our charitable efforts, a lot of our political discussion has been focused on how do we humanize a pretty inhumane, unsustainable economic system. But that 3-step process of grow the economy faster, try to then sequester some of that back through tax, and then use that to sort of heal the damage of step 1, that's no longer appropriate in the reality of a finite planet in an environmental sense. So we need to start thinking about a different way of constructing the economy and different ways of delivering good lives for people. And that's what we're describing as a well-being economy. And it's essentially saying, we need to have an economy that delivers for people first time round. It's about social justice on a healthy planet. And it's really exciting to see the extent to which that debate has really taken off in Scotland. I think there's a lot of good rhetoric. I often think, though, in Scotland, we're very good at talking the talk. I think if we could bank the rhetoric, the political discussion around the wellbeing economy, we would be there by now. But we're obviously so far away from that. And perhaps that's something we can talk about later on. The gap between rhetoric and implementation. But essentially a wellbeing economy is about getting the economy to do more of the heavy lifting. So not relying on step 3, not waiting till after the fact, till 5 o'clock in the afternoon to patch and clean up, not celebrating, slightly redistributing, but saying, why did we allow the gap between rich and poor to open up so wide in the first place? So it's essentially about designing the economic system in a way that delivers more equality and more sustainability in the first place. And there are a whole lot of mechanisms to do that. It's not just one lever. There are so many policy and practice shifts we need to think about. But some of the key ones that I like to talk about are, it's a fairly ugly term, but I think it's an absolutely really exhilarating concept, this idea of pre-distribution. Essentially, can we create market outcomes that deliver more equality from the beginning? And that requires things like pro-social business models, like cooperatives, where workers own more of the value creation themselves rather than it being extracted up to remote shareholders and essentially returning the rents on their economic wealth already. It's things like better endowments, investing in health and education through our collective institutions. It's things like the foundational economy, supporting those maybe slightly unglamorous, but bread and butter economic entities in our communities that won't up and leave as soon as the government increases the environmental regulations or increases the taxes. So things like supermarkets, hospitals, schools, and so on, really investing in those foundational economy activities that really are what are getting us through COVID right now. It's about community wealth building, creating virtuous circles of local economic multipliers through local procurement, local ownership, and those sorts of things. It's about really recasting the role of business as well. What sort of business models do we need to see in a wellbeing economy of Scotland? Yeah, what sort of ownership structures, what sort of DNA do we need in our businesses? It's about looking at how we price things as well. I mean, it's no longer okay that our prices that we see when we're making a decision whether to purchase something don't take the full account of the environment or social cost of those activities. So there's a whole lot of changes, and there's a lovely table on our website that I think you'll really like called From the Old Way to the New Way. And it sets out at a glance really a shift, the sort of shift across a whole lot of different subject areas of how the current system responds to things and how a wellbeing economy might respond to things. And it's a live document. People are always adding suggestions and creating things. So I'm sure you'll have some ideas you might want to add in there, but I'll recommend you dive into that.